If your father or your grandfather ever rode a British motorcycle, there's a fair chance the finest machine he ever dreamed of owning wore a single word on its tank: Ariel. From a works at Selly Oak in Birmingham came the Square 4, a 100-mile-an-hour superbike, a gentleman's tourer so smooth it was exported to police forces in California, built by around 2,000 skilled hands, the same works that quietly trained the men who would go on to run Triumph, Norton, and BSA. Ariel survived a bankruptcy in the depths of the Depression. It survived 2 world wars, building dispatch bikes by the tens of thousands. It survived the lean, hungry austerity years and came back every time. And then, after some 66 years of building motorcycles, the works simply fell silent. How does a firm that survived all of that trained half an industry, just vanish? That is what this film is about. Chapter 1. Spirit of the Air. The story begins, as so many Birmingham stories do, with something small. In the early 1870s, in a workshop in the south of the city, 2 men were bent over a bicycle wheel, trying to make it lighter. Their names were James Starley and William Hillman. Birmingham in those years called itself the city of 1,000 trades, and it very nearly was. Brass and buttons, guns and gas fittings, jewellery and bicycles. The place ran on the skill of men who could make almost anything out of metal, in workshops crammed cheek by jowl along streets that never went quiet. It was into that world that Starley and Hillman brought their idea. What they built in 1870 was a high-wheeled bicycle, a penny farthing, but a clever one. Its great wheel laced with fine wire, spokes drawn tight enough to carry a rider without the dead iron heaviness of the older machines. It was quick. It was elegant. When it ran, it seemed almost to float. So they reached for Shakespeare and they named it Ariel, after the airy spirit of the tempest, the servant who does his master's bidding on the wind, the spirit of the air. It was a good name for a light machine, and it was a better name than they knew, because that name would outlast very nearly everything else about them. The wire-spoke wheel they patented changed cycling. Hillman, in time, would leave bicycles behind and put his own name on motorcars, the Hillman mark that ran on British roads until the 1970s. The Starley family would help shape the whole of the British cycle trade from these same few streets. But the Ariel name stayed where it started, at Bournebrook in the southern reaches of Birmingham, that the post office would one day rename Selly Oak, where the little Bourne Brook still ran past the brickworks and the smoke never quite lifted from the rooftops. By the turn of the century, a bicycle name was no longer enough. The horseless carriage was coming, and Ariel meant to be part of it. In 1898, the firm built its first powered vehicle, a spidery little tricycle driven by a French Dédion engine, the sort of contraption that frightened horses and thrilled young men with money to burn. 4 years later, in 1902, came the first true Ariel motorcycle, and in that same year the business passed to a man named Charles Sangster, whose firm, Components Limited, took Ariel in. Sangster made his living from the small, precise parts that the whole cycle and motor trade depended on: the hubs, the spindles, the fittings that nobody thinks about until one of them breaks. He was an engineer to the bone. Under him, Ariel stopped being merely a name on a bicycle and became a motorcycle manufacturer with ambitions. Its badge carried a rearing horse. Its slogan carried no false modesty at all: the modern motorcycle. There is a shape to these early years that only becomes clear much later. The firm that would one day build a 100-mile-an-hour superbike had begun as a patent for a bicycle wheel. The name it carried had already survived being bought, absorbed, and rebadged more than once. Ariel was, from the very start, a survivor, a spirit that kept finding new bodies to live in, shedding one owner and taking on another, refusing to die when lesser names around it simply vanished from the trade. Charles Sangster had a son. He had been born in 1896, and his name was John Young Sangster, though almost nobody who knew him ever called him anything but Jack. And it is Jack Sangster, more than any single designer and more than any single machine, who holds the whole of this story together. He would save Ariel once, in its darkest hour. Then he would come to own the company that made it famous, and the 2 great rivals that stood beside it. And he would, without ever meaning to, help build the machine that would one day grind Ariel down. The man who rescued the spirit of the air was also, in the end, part of the reason it fell silent. Chapter 2. The Man Who Saved It Twice. Ariel's first brush with death came early. In 1911, Components Limited, the parent firm, slid into receivership, and the whole enterprise wobbled on the edge before steadying itself. That was the warning. Nobody heeded it. The real blow came 20 years later, and it very nearly finished them for good. By the early 1930s, the British motorcycle industry was in freefall. In 1928, it had built 147,000 machines in a single year, a torrent of two-wheeled transport pouring out of the Midlands and onto the roads of the world. 2 years later, in 1930, that figure had collapsed to 74,400. The Depression had arrived, and it was dragging the whole trade down with it. Half the market had simply evaporated. Across Birmingham and Coventry, works that had roared through the 20s fell quiet, and men who had never known anything but a wage packet on Friday found the gates locked against them. In September 1932, Components Limited went bankrupt. For most firms, that is the end of the sentence. The receivers move in, the tooling is sold for scrap, the workers go home, and a name that once meant something becomes a single line in a ledger of debts. But Jack Sangster was not most men, and he refused to stand by and watch his father's company die in front of him. He was 36 years old, and he had already lived several lives. He had been educated at Hurstpierpoint College. He had served in the Great War with the City of Birmingham Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He was no boardroom passenger who had inherited a name. He had designed a light car of his own, the Ariel 9, and had a hand in the Rover 8 besides. He understood machinery from the drawing board outward, not merely from the balance sheet. And so, when the receivers put the Ariel motorcycle business up for sale amid the wreckage of his family firm, Jack Sangster bought it back. He bought it cheaply, because in 1932 everything was cheap and almost nobody was buying. He bought the tools, by one account, for next to nothing. He rehired the cream of the staff, the men who actually knew how to build the machines, whose hands held knowledge no drawing could capture, and he moved the whole operation 500 yards down the road to a plant he could afford to run. He renamed it Ariel Motors, JS Limited, put his own initials into the title, and started the presses running again. In the deepest trough of the worst slump the industry had ever known, one man reached into a bankruptcy and pulled a motorcycle company back out of it, still breathing, still building. That act of nerve is the reason there is a story to tell at all. Without it, Ariel ends here in 1932, a footnote among the dozens of Midlands Marquez the Depression swept away. Instead, it was about to enter its golden age. But Jack Sangster's ambitions did not stop at Selly Oak, and this is where the tale begins to darken at the edges. In the mid-1930s, he reached across to Coventry and bought Triumph, reportedly for £50,000, a mark that was itself in trouble, and set about turning it round. In 1951, he sold Triumph onto the Birmingham Small Arms Company, the industrial giant everyone simply called BSA, for £2.5 million. It was one of the shrewdest deals in the history of the British motor trade. And in 1956, Jack Sangster went one step further and became chairman of BSA itself. Follow that thread, and the shape of it becomes plain, though nobody living through it could have seen where it led. One Birmingham industrialist now sat astride all three of the great names, Ariel, Triumph, and BSA. The very group whose internal rivalries would one day close the gates at Selly Oak was being assembled, patiently, piece by piece, by the man who had saved Selly Oak in the first place. The saviour was quietly building the house that his firm's executioner would come to live in. None of that was visible in the 1930s. All anyone could see then was a rescue, and a firm coming, roaring back to life. To turn that rescue into greatness, Sangster needed men who could draw, men who could give Ariel machines that no rival could match. He had already found one of them. A quiet, brilliant engineer named Val Page had joined Ariel back in 1925, and Page was about to hand the firm the backbone it would carry for the next 30 years, and to open a drawing office that would change the whole British industry. Chapter 3. The cigarette packet engine. Val Page had come to Ariel from J.A. Prestwich, the London engine house everyone in the trade knew as JAP, where he had designed the power units for the Brew Superior, the machine T.E. Lawrence rode, and the machine Lawrence would die on in a crash on a Dorset road in 1935. Page was not a showman. He was the sort of designer whose name the public never learned, though his work sat quietly beneath half the famous motorcycles of the age. He has been called, with some justice, the most prolific and successful motorcycle designer of his period, and one of the least celebrated. And in 1926 and 1927, he gave Ariel a range of single-cylinder machines, the so-called black Ariels, whose basic architecture would underpin every Ariel four-stroke single right the way to the end of the 1950s. He built the firm a foundation that would carry it for 30 years. Now it needed a spire. The spire arrived in the shape of a young man in a hurry, named Edward Turner. Turner had run a motorcycle shop of his own, built a machine with his own hands, and become utterly convinced he could design engines better than the men doing it for a living. He was forceful, impatient, sometimes impossible, and he was right about himself more often than not. Around 1928, he worked out a radical idea: an engine with 4 cylinders arranged in a square, 2 by 2, compact enough to sit in a motorcycle frame where an ordinary inline-4 would never fit. The legend has it, he sketched the layout on the back of a cigarette packet. Whether that is quite true no longer matters. What matters is that he took the idea round the trade, knocking on doors, and the doors kept closing on him. And the largest of those doors belonged to BSA, the biggest motorcycle maker in the world, which looked at Edward Turner's Square 4 and turned it away. Jack Sangster did not turn it away. He gave Turner a drawing office at Selly Oak, an assistant, and the freedom to build the thing and see if it would run. The assistant was a teenage draftsman named Bert Hopwood, who would go on to design the Norton Dominator and, decades later, to write the angriest and saddest book the British motorcycle industry ever produced, a memoir he titled, "With a Bitterness You Can Still Feel." Whatever happened to the British motorcycle industry? Hopwood worked under Val Page, and so, in one modest drawing office in one Birmingham suburb, 3 of the most important designers the whole industry would ever know were bent over the same boards at the same time. That office was becoming something close to a miracle, very nearly an incubator for the entire British trade. Turner would leave to run Triumph and give the world the Speed Twin, and later, the Bonneville, the most famous British motorcycle ever built. Hopwood would become a legend at Norton. Page would design machines for half the marques in the Midlands. The list of men who passed through Ariel reads like a roll call of everyone who mattered in the years that followed. Ariel was where the talent was grown before it was scattered across the industry, and BSA, the firm that had waved Edward Turner's engine away as not worth the risk, would one day own every last piece of it. The engine itself made its debut at the Olympia show in London in late 1930, offered as a 500cc model for the following year. The trade nicknamed it the Squarielle, and it stopped visitors in their tracks. Here was a 4-cylinder motorcycle, smooth as a sewing machine, in an age when most machines still hammered along on a single lung. In 1931, it won the Maud's Trophy, the industry's award for a genuine, independently witnessed feat of reliability, not a marketing claim, but a proven one. And Ariel's marketing man, Victor Mole, dreamed up a run of publicity stunts, the Ariel 7s, to keep the name on the lips of every enthusiast in the country. The engine grew to 600cc in 1932. Then Turner redesigned it wholesale for 1937 as an overhead valve unit of just under a full litre, the machine that would become the definitive Square 4, 1,000 cubic centimetres of smooth, effortless, unhurried power, unlike anything else on 2 wheels in Britain. Turner had done more than design an engine. He had built Ariel a reputation for daring, and the money and the prestige that flowed from it helped Sangster reach across to Coventry and buy Triumph, the very mark that Turner himself would go on to make immortal. By 1936, Edward Turner was Ariel's general manager and chief designer, running the place he had walked into a few years earlier as an outsider with a sketch that nobody else in the trade had believed in, and running quietly alongside the glamorous Square 4 was Val Page's other great gift to the firm, the Red Hunter, a range of sporting overhead valve singles in 250, 350 and 500cc, sold from 1932 onward. The Red Hunters gave Ariel its competition credentials and its everyday bread and butter, both at once. The Square 4 was the aristocrat, the machine that made the headlines and turned heads in the showroom. The Red Hunter was the honest workhorse that paid the wages week in, week out. Between them, they carried Ariel to the summit of its craft, and into the finest years the works at Selly Oak would ever know. Chapter 4. Cathedral at Selly Oak. To stand outside the Ariel works on Grange Road in the years after the war was to stand in the densest concentration of motorcycle engineering anywhere on the face of the earth. Across a few square miles of the West Midlands sat BSA at Small Heath, the largest motorcycle maker in the world, and Norton and Velocette and Ariel, all within an easy ride of one another, all drawing on the same deep pool of skilled hands, all quietly competing for the same customers in the same showrooms. This was the workshop of the world. And Ariel, though smaller than its mighty neighbour down the road, had staked out a particular corner of it that was entirely its own. Not the biggest, never the biggest, but among the very finest. When Jack Sangster reconstituted the firm in 1932, it employed around 2,000 workers, which made it one of the largest firms in the whole district. And from the beginning, it built its name not on volume, but on quality. On the simple, stubborn idea that an Ariel was a machine a man aspired to, saved for, and kept for years. The numbers carry the whole philosophy inside them. In 1948, the year the country was still on ration books and rebuilding from the war, Selly Oak turned out 7,517 machines across the entire 12 months. Of those, 919 were square fours. That was never meant to be a torrent. It was a careful, deliberate trickle of something precious. Imagine arriving for the early shift, coming down the Bristol Road on the number 63 bus, the works gates on Grange Road standing directly opposite Wesley Richards, the famous gunmakers, the smell of hot oil and cutting fluid already hanging in the cool morning air before you had even clocked in. Inside, the machine shop and the engine shop ran with the particular rhythm of men who had done the same skilled work for so many years that they could very nearly do it in their sleep. Turning, boring, fitting, lapping, testing, each man a specialist in his own few square feet of the process. The paint shop laid down the deep two-tone finishes and the white-wall tyres that the export machines wore. And down on the test bed, a finished square four did not clatter and bark the way a big single did. It droned. Riders reached again and again for the same word to describe it. Car-like. 1,000 cubic centimetres turning over with a smoothness and a refinement that no ordinary motorcycle in the world could match. The square four was never cheap, and it was never meant to be. It was a dignified mount, a connoisseur's machine, and it wore a price that put it within reach of a small motorcar. A man who bought one was buying rather more than transport. He was buying membership of a small and knowing club. The people who understood that a motorcycle could be a refined thing, a machine built for covering long distances in comfort and near silence, as much a gentleman's carriage as a sporting toy. Ariel had chosen, quite deliberately, to sell class rather than quantity. And for the better part of 20 years, class had sold. The men who built these machines have left us little in the way of testimony, an honest gap, and one worth admitting rather than filling with invention. The shop floor at Selly Oak did not write memoirs, but we know the shape of the working life. Skilled, proud, unhurried, tied to the hooter and the shift and the Friday wage, lived out in the terraced streets that ran down toward the brook. A man might spend his whole working life inside those gates, and his father before him, learning a craft that could not be hurried and could not be taught from a book, the feel of a bearing seating home, the sound of an engine running true. The works and the streets around it were bound together, the one giving the other its wages and its rhythm and its reason to exist. And we know what they were building, because a good deal of it is still running on the roads of the world today, 70 years on, cherished by people who were not even born when Selly Oak turned it out, because most of what they built was leaving the country altogether. These were the export or die years, when a bankrupt Britain shipped its finest manufactured goods abroad to earn the foreign currency it desperately needed, and the square four was exactly the sort of prestige product the overseas markets craved. The machines went out to the Commonwealth. They went to North America, funneled through a handful of West Coast importers, first Alfred Child and then, from 1949, a San Francisco dealer named Hap Alzina, who sold Ariel square fours to Californian police forces to patrol the wide Pacific highways. The racer and dealer Ed Kretz flew the flag on the American tracks. Picture it, a Birmingham gentleman's tourer, built by hand a few streets from the Bourne Brook, wearing the uniform of a Californian police department under the western sun. That was the reach of the thing at its height. Every one of those export machines mattered to a country counting its foreign earnings pound by pound. A crated square four leaving the docks was not simply a sale, it was a small, gleaming argument that Britain still made the finest things in the world and could still sell them to anyone who could afford the best. The men at Selly Oak knew it. They built each one as though the reputation of the whole country rode out with it, because in a small way, it did. There was one flaw, and the men at Selly Oak understood it better than any outsider ever could. In that neat square block of 4 cylinders, the 2 at the back sat trapped in the shadow of the 2 at the front, starved of the cooling air that washed over the leading pair, and they ran hot. Ariel chased that problem for the better part of 2 decades and never entirely solved it. A beautiful machine, admired around the world, with a weakness built into the very shape of it that no amount of care or cleverness could quite cure. The engineers lived with it. They loved the machine anyway. And there is something of the firm's whole fate in that, a magnificent thing carrying a fault it could not design out, sold and cherished regardless. The Red Hunter carried the sporting flame all the while, and from 1955, a young trials rider named Sammy Miller began winning on an Ariel, a modified competition single, registered GOV 132, that would go on to become one of the most famous motorcycles in all of Britain, its registration plate known to enthusiasts the way a racehorse's name is known. The works could compete and win at the very top. It could also build in sheer volume when the nation demanded it, and the war had proved as much. Val Page had come back to Ariel in May of 1939 to develop a military machine, a rugged 350cc single derived from the sporting Red Hunter, its frame shaped in part by a trials bike that the rider Fred Povey had taken through the punishing Scottish 6 days. They called it the W/NG. Between 1940 and 1945, Ariel built something close to 47,000 of them, carrying dispatch riders through the war for the British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Admiralty, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Women's Land Army. It made Ariel the 4th largest supplier of motorcycles to the British and Empire forces in the entire conflict. When it truly counted, the small prestige firm from Selly Oak could turn its hand to tens of thousands. Presiding over the post-war works was a former racer named Ken Wistance, at the head of Ariel's board, and to the public, and to the men on the floor, Ariel still looked every inch the master of its own house. It designed its own machines, it set its own course, it carried its own proud name on its own proud tank, out through its own gates on Grange Road. But that was, by then, only partly true. And this is the crack in the vaulting of the cathedral, the flaw you have to know about before any of what follows makes sense. Because in December 1944, in the middle of the war, Ariel had quietly been sold to BSA. The workforce had even downed tools over it, refusing to work until they were promised that Selly Oak would stay open and the name would live on. From that day forward, the great decisions about Ariel's money and Ariel's future were no longer made on Grange Road at all. They were made a few miles away, at Small Heath. The independence that everyone could see, the autonomy the men on the floor still believed in, was already, in the ledgers that nobody on the shop floor ever saw, an illusion. The cathedral still rang with its own bells, but it no longer owned the ground it stood on. Chapter 5. The Summit. The middle of the 1950s was the highest ground Ariel ever stood on, and, as so often in these stories, the summit and the turning point turned out to be the very same place. The Square 4 had reached its finest form. In 1953, the redesigned Mark II version, with its 4 separate exhaust pipes and a reworked cylinder head, finally delivered a genuine, honest 100 miles an hour. The connoisseur's superbike made real at last, more than a decade after the promise of it had first been made. The following year, in 1954, Ariel added the Huntmaster, a 650cc twin built around a proven BSA A10 engine dressed in Ariel's own cycle parts. It was quick, it was reliable, and it was beloved of the sidecar men who wanted to haul a wife and children in comfort at speed. The range looked strong, the order books looked healthy. To anyone glancing at Selly Oak in the middle of the decade, the firm looked as secure and as settled as it had ever been in its life, and its guardian was about to become the single most powerful man in the British motorcycle industry. In 1956, at BSA, a boardroom contest came to a head. The incumbent chairman was Sir Bernard Docker, a flamboyant figure whose gold-plated Daimler motorcars and famously extravagant wife, Lady Docker, had made him a fixture of the gossip columns far beyond the dry world of the motor trade. There were those who felt the group needed a serious industrialist at the helm rather than a showman. Against Docker stood Jack Sangster, the man who had saved Ariel from the receivers, built Triumph back up from trouble, and then sold it into the group at an enormous profit. Whatever else he was, Sangster was serious, and he knew motorcycles from the inside out. The board voted. Sangster won, 6 votes to 3. Docker was out, and the man who had reached into a bankruptcy in 1932 to rescue one small Birmingham motorcycle firm now sat at the very head of the largest motorcycle combine in the world. It was the crowning moment of a remarkable industrial life. It should have been the surest guarantee of Ariel's future that anyone could have imagined. Sangster moved quickly, and he moved his oldest ally up with him. He made Edward Turner, the outsider he had backed a quarter of a century earlier, the man with the cigarette packet sketch that BSA had rejected, head of the entire automotive division. And that division now took in Ariel and Triumph and BSA motorcycles and Daimler cars and the coach builder Carbides too. The two men who had made Ariel great in the 1930s were now, in the 1950s, running very nearly everything on 2 wheels and a good deal on 4. It ought to have been the safest possible position for the little works at Selly Oak. Its own founder ran the group. Its own former chief designer ran the division. Who could possibly be better placed to protect an Ariel than the very two men who had built its reputation in the first place? But power inside a combine does not always flow the way loyalty suggests it should. Turner had his favourites, and his clear favourite was Triumph, the mark he had made a legend, the mark that carried his own finest work and his own name's glory. Ariel and Triumph and BSA were no longer 3 proud, independent rivals, sharpening one another to a keener edge. They were 3 children of the same parent now, and the parents' affections were not shared out evenly among them. Each man at the summit had a mark he loved best, and the one that nobody at the top loved best, the quiet, prestigious, low-volume one down at Selly Oak, was beginning, very slowly, to look like the one that could be steered somewhere gently out of the way. Some who lived through it came to believe something sharper than that Turner, forceful and territorial, used his grip on the group's affairs to nudge Ariel down a path where it could never threaten the Marquez he cared about more. That is an interpretation, offered years afterward, and not a thing that can be proved. What can be said plainly is simpler and sadder. The men best placed to defend Ariel had other loves and other priorities, and a whole combine to run, and Ariel's turn to be defended, when it came, would never quite arrive. Nobody standing at the works gates could see the cliff yet. The machines were selling. The Square 4 had never been better. The founder was chairman, and the master designer ran the division, and the sun still fell every morning on the Ariel works opposite the gunmakers. From Grange Road, in the bright middle of the 1950s, the future looked like nothing so much as more of the same. More fine machines, more export orders, more long years of the quiet, confident craft that Ariel had always stood for. They were standing at the very top of the mountain, but the mountain was about to shift under their feet. A crisis in the Suez Canal was about to send the price of petrol soaring and the British public rushing toward anything cheap to run. A little Italian scooter was about to change what an ordinary person expected a 2-wheeler to be. A small, clever car was coming out of Longbridge that would rewrite the whole idea of basic transport. And far away, in a country still rebuilding from the war, a company called Honda was beginning to make motorcycles by the 100,000. The tide was turning against everything Ariel was and everything it had chosen to be, and the men at the summit, looking out over their kingdom, could not yet feel it coming in. Chapter 6. Reading the Signs. The tide that would carry Ariel out to sea began, of all places, on a canal in Egypt. In the autumn of 1956, the Suez Crisis closed the canal and choked off the flow of oil, and by the end of November, a rationing scheme was back in force across Britain, around 10 gallons of petrol a month for the ordinary motorist, held in place until the following May. Overnight, thrift was fashionable again. People who had never once thought about the cost of a mile now counted everyone. Cars sat on driveways while their owners worked out whether the journey was worth the coupons, and into that anxious, penny-pinching market poured the small, the cheap and the frugal. The bubble cars, the microcars, and above all the neat little scooters coming out of Italy. The Vespa and the Lambretta were not really motorcycles at all, and that was precisely the point. They were clean. They were weatherproof. A typist could ride one to the office in her good coat and step off without a mark on her. They sipped fuel by the thimbleful, and they were changing what an ordinary person in an ordinary town expected a two-wheeler to be. For a firm that made heavy, oily, expensive machines for enthusiasts, they were a warning written in neon, and Ariel's board had no intention of being swept quietly aside. Under Ken Wistons, the men who ran Selly Oak resolved on what one account calls a valiant bid, a determined refusal to be overwhelmed by the newer, trendier machines now flooding the market, machines that included, awkwardly, the products of their own partners at BSA and Triumph. They would not simply preside over a graceful decline and let the world move past them. They would build something new, something bold enough to meet the moment head-on and beat it. It was the right instinct. It was, in its way, an admirable one, and very nearly everything that went wrong afterward flowed directly out of it. Ariel's board read the signs, and the signs all pointed one way. For the mighty four-strokes at Selly Oak were getting old, and worse, they were getting hard to shift. The square four was magnificent and it was dear, and the market for a hand-built gentleman's superbike was thinning with every passing season. By one account, a figure worth treating with some caution, but a devastating one if it holds, the flagship Square 4 sold just 2 examples in the whole of 1957. 2, in a full year, from the works that had once shipped Square 4s to police forces on the far side of the world. The heavyweight twins were no great sellers either. The whole range needed reinventing, and reinventing a motorcycle range costs a very great deal of money. And here the crack in the vaulting from a decade earlier began, at last, to matter. Ariel had been a BSA subsidiary since 1944. The money to remake the range did not sit in a drawer at Selly Oak, to be spent as the men on Grange Road saw fit. It sat a few miles away at Small Heath, in the accounts of a parent that had many children, and only so much to give any one of them. Every pound Ariel wanted, Ariel had to ask for, and a firm that must ask for its future is a firm that no longer entirely owns it. There was a deeper trouble buried inside that arrangement, one that would take years to show its full damage. Within the BSA group, the great marquees were not truly pulling together at all. Ariel, Triumph and BSA still competed against one another, for the same customers in the same showrooms, for the same slices of the same finite budget. 3 proud names locked in a slow, wasteful contest under a single roof, each fighting for money and attention that a wiser combine would simply have pooled. It was a house divided against itself, and it had already chosen Ariel, quietly, as the child who would go without. There was worse still, though, in the field Ariel was about to charge onto. The lightweight end of the market, the very ground the firm meant to plant its future in, was already crowded and already being won by others. The Italian scooters owned it, the microcars were coming for it, and in workshops half a world away, the Japanese were learning to build small, cheap, reliable machines in numbers that would soon make the whole of the British trade look like a cottage industry. Ariel was not choosing an empty field. It was choosing the single most contested patch of ground on the entire map and staking everything on winning it. There was worse coming, though nobody yet knew its shape. In 1959, a small, clever car would emerge from Longbridge, only a few miles to the west. The Mini, 4 seats and a roof, and a heater for not very much money at all, and it would quietly begin to devour the one job the motorcycle had always owned outright, carrying an ordinary family from here to there in all weathers, and far away, in a country still climbing out of the rubble of the war, a firm called Honda was learning to build motorcycles in numbers the British trade could not yet bring itself to imagine. So Ariel turned to Val Page, the quiet master who had given the firm its backbone 30 years before, who had drawn the Black Ariels and the Red Hunter and the wartime dispatch machine, and it asked him to draw the future. The brief that came down, endorsed by the board under Ken Wistons and blessed by Edward Turner above them, was rational to the last decimal point. Scooters were booming. The 4-strokes were dying. The research pointed toward a cheap, clean, weatherproof commuter that a clerk could ride to work in a suit and arrive without a spot of oil on his cuff. The logic was sound. Every single step of it was sound. And that is the cruel heart of this whole chapter of the story. Not a foolish decision made by foolish men. A reasonable decision made by clever ones, reading a real market with real care and arriving at a real answer. They did not misread the signs. What would destroy them was not the reading. It was what they chose to stake on being right. Chapter 7. Betting the Works. They gave Val Page something a designer dreams of his whole life and almost never gets. The trade paper. The motorcycle, writing in the summer of 1958, put it plainly. Page and his team had been handed that rarest of things. A completely free hand. A clean sheet of paper. No parts carried over from the old machines. No committee looking over the shoulder. No compromise forced by the accountants. Build the motorcycle you believe the future needs, and build it properly. And Page, working alongside his engineer Bernard Knight, built something genuinely, undeniably brilliant. It was called the Ariel Leader. At its heart sat a compact 250cc two-stroke twin, closely modelled on an admired German design, the Adler. But the engine was only the beginning of it. Page wrapped the whole machine in a pressed steel structure, a hollow beam frame that doubled as the bodywork, and hid the fuel and the workings inside itself, and he enclosed nearly all of the rest. A built-in windscreen, leg shields to turn the weather aside, a dummy fuel tank that was really a lockable box for your gloves and your sandwiches, smooth panelling that kept the oil and the mud away from your trousers and your eye alike. It offered, as an option, the first flashing indicators ever fitted to a British motorcycle. It was clean, it was comfortable, and it handled beautifully. A man really could ride it to the office in a good suit and think no more about it. The press adored it. The motorcycle gave the Leader an unheard-of 6 pages at its launch, illustrated with 9 detailed technical drawings by the artist John Ferguson, the sort of coverage a magazine reserves for something it believes will matter for years to come. The machine went on sale in July of 1958, and the reviewers reached for superlatives. Here was a British motorcycle you could ride in the rain and step off dry. Here was refinement, cleanliness, comfort, and genuine engineering ambition, all in one clever package, from a works that many had quietly written off as a maker of handsome antiques. And when the readers of Motorcycle News voted for the very first time for their machine of the year, they did not choose a thundering 4-stroke. They chose the Ariel Leader, over the Triumph Bonneville, over the BSA Gold Stars, over the Norton Dominators. Every one of them launched into the same glittering season, every one of them a legend in the making. A little enclosed 2-stroke commuter from Selly Oak had beaten the most glamorous motorcycles in Britain on their own turf, in front of the entire trade. The men who had built it had every right to feel they had read the future correctly and answered it brilliantly. The mistake was never the motorcycle. It is important to hold on to that, because the simple version of this story gets it exactly wrong. The Leader was not a blunder. The Leader was a small masterpiece. The mistake was what came next. Because in 1959, having built their brilliant new machine, Ariel's management made the decision that this entire story turns upon. They dropped every 4-stroke the firm made. All of them. The Square 4, the Red Hunter singles, the Huntmaster twins, the whole heritage of the marque, 30 years of engineering and reputation, swept off the price list in a single stroke of a pen. And the tooling, the jigs, the dies, the patterns and fixtures that would have been needed to ever build any of them again, was disposed of. There was to be no way back. The boats were not merely left behind on the shore. They were set alight and pushed out to burn. On the factory floor, this was not a figure of speech. It was skips and scrap merchants and men breaking up their own life's work. The patterns for the Square 4's crankcases, the jigs that held a Red Hunter frame square while it was brazed, the fixtures and the gauges, built up over 30 years of hard-won, undocumented knowledge, the accumulated cleverness of a whole works, the kind of thing that lives in steel and in the hands that made it and can never be written down. All of it went out as scrap, or was simply smashed, because a firm that has decided never to build a thing again has no earthly reason to keep the means of building it. 30 years of craft, reduced to weight and sold by the ton. 15,639 Square 4s had been built across 28 years. The very last of them left the works in the middle of 1959, and the machine that had defined everything Ariel stood for, the connoisseur's superbike, the car-like tourer, the pride of the whole works, was simply gone. Years later, the great engineer Phil Vincent would write its epitaph in the pages of Motorcycle. calling the Square 4 a victim of the modern trend towards small, high-revving power units. The enthusiasts mourned it openly. The historian Bob Curry recorded American riders crossing the Atlantic to comb the British dealers and the scrapyards for the last remaining examples of a machine that would never, ever be made again. Now, whether the four-strokes could truly have been saved is a fair question, and very nearly an unanswerable one. They were old. They were costly to build. By the middle of the 1960s, a Square 4 would have cost a rider around £350, which put it well beyond most working men. Keeping the old range in production would have swallowed money the parent at Small Heath was plainly disinclined to spend. There was a real and honest case for letting them go. But there is a world of difference between letting a range quietly fade and destroying the very means of ever building it again. Ariel did the second thing. It bet its entire existence on one new model, and in the same movement it burned the lifeboat that might have caught the firm if the bet ever went wrong. And not everyone inside the works had wanted it that way. Val Page himself, the very man who had drawn the Leader, had carried a broader vision than the one his masters were willing to pay for. He did not want to stake everything on a single throw of the dice. He wanted a range. He sketched a tiny four-stroke, barely 70cc, to reach the buyer at the very bottom of the market. He wanted a four-stroke 250, canted forward, to stand in the showroom alongside the two-stroke and give a rider who still wanted a proper little engine something to buy. A machine good for 75 miles an hour. He had a four-stroke twin version of the Arrow on the drawing board by 1960. Variety, insurance, more than one idea, so that if one failed, another might catch the firm. But the executives above him did not share the dream, and the development money ran dry before any of it could be realized. So Ariel walked out to market, carrying a single machine and no second act, and the whole future of every man on the floor at Selly Oak now rode entirely on whether the public would go on buying that one bike for as long as it took to build the next one. And there was no next one coming. Chapter 8. The Second Wind That Wasn't. For a while, a brief, bright, deceiving while, it looked as though the bet might just come off. The first trouble was one nobody at Selly Oak should have been surprised by. Not everybody wanted a motorcycle that looked like a scooter. The Leader's full enclosure, so clever and so weatherproof, put off the very sort of rider who believed a motorcycle ought to look like a motorcycle. All engine and exhaust and honest mechanical purpose, nothing hidden behind panels. So Ariel answered them. In 1959 and into 1960, it stripped the Leader back to its bones and produced the Arrow. Lighter, cheaper, and naked. The engine and the workings out in the open where a traditionalist could see and admire them. Underneath the panels, it was the same fine machine. It simply wore a face the old guard could love. And it worked. The Arrow was voted Machine of the Year for 1960, Ariel's second win in succession. The Sporting Golden Arrow followed for 1961 and carried off the Reader's Award a third year running. 3 years, 3 machines, 3 times the readers of the trade press placed Ariel above every rival in the land. At its very height, the naked Arrow was selling 1,600 machines in a single month. This was not a dying product. On the page, in the showroom, in the letters columns of the press, this was a genuine second wind, and to the outside world and to the men on the floor, Ariel still looked like a firm in charge of its own destiny, designing its own machines, winning its own awards, master of its own house. But that mastery was, by now, mostly for show. The letters columns did not pay the bills, and a second wind is not a gale, and the arithmetic underneath the trophies was merciless. Across the entire 7-year life of the Leader and the Arrow together, Ariel built somewhere between 22 and 36,000 machines, depending on which set of figures you choose to believe. It was a respectable number for a works of Ariel's size. It was also, set beside the competition, very nearly nothing. In a comparable span of years, the makers of the Vespa turned out 350,000 examples of a single model of scooter, 350,000 against Ariel's tens of thousands. The Italians, and soon, far more dangerously, the Japanese, were playing a game of sheer volume that a small prestige works in Birmingham had never learned to play and could not begin to learn now. And the motor car was closing in from the other side. By 1964, an Ariel Leader cost a buyer around £225. A brand new Mini could be had for under £500. For roughly twice the money, a family got a weatherproof steel box with 4 seats, a boot and a heater, and the single strongest reason to own a motorcycle at all, the job of everyday family transport, was draining away with every Mini that Longbridge sold. The two-wheeler was being squeezed from above by the car and from below by the scooter, and Ariel had planted itself precisely in the middle of the vice, and the customer himself was changing, right across the country. The young man who in 1935 would have saved for a motorcycle now saved for a car, or bought a scooter for the town and thought no more of it. The motorcycle, as a working family's only transport, the very thing that had built firms like Ariel, was quietly becoming a thing of the past. Not because anyone decided it should, because the country was growing a little richer, year by year, and a car was creeping within reach of the ordinary wage. Ariel could win every award the press had to give, and it did. But the awards were handed out by enthusiasts, and the market was being settled by ordinary people, and ordinary people were walking, slowly and without any malice at all, toward the showrooms that sold cars. There was a margin problem too, hiding beneath the sales figures. A machine sold at the cheap end of the market earns its maker only a few pounds, and a few pounds multiplied by tens of thousands is not the broad river of profit that flows from hundreds of thousands. Ariel was selling just enough to look healthy, and nowhere near enough to fund its own survival. Every arrow that left the works was a small triumph of engineering and a thin sliver of money, and the sums never came close to what it would have cost to build the generation of machine that might have come after. The trophies were real. The profit was not. There was still a way to fight, and Val Page had already seen it. Keep developing, keep evolving, build the 4-cylinder and 4-stroke machines that might have carried the whole design forward into the 1960s as something far more than a clever commuter. But that took investment, and the decision on investment did not belong to Ariel. It belonged to BSA. And BSA, surveying its Birmingham children and deciding where to place its bets, simply let the leader's reins drop. The parent that held the purse strings chose, quietly and without drama, not to loosen them here. The machine that had won 3 straight years of awards was left to coast, undeveloped, toward the end of its natural life, with absolutely nothing standing behind it, because the 4 strokes were ash, and the tooling was gone. Meanwhile, the ground kept shifting. Honda and its rivals were not merely building more machines than Britain, they were building cheaper, more reliable, easier machines, learning fast, and coming closer every single year. The volume that Ariel could never reach was exactly the volume that let a Japanese firm spread its costs, sharpen its quality and drop its prices. In a spiral, a small Birmingham works simply could not enter. Ariel had brought a beautifully made rapier to a fight that was about to be settled by artillery. The men at the summit had each loved another mark best. Now the price of that preference came due. Not as a speech, not as a decision anyone had to defend out loud, but as money that was simply never spent on Selly Oak. Chapter 9. Asset stripped. The end, when it came, did not come with a bang. It came the way these things nearly always come. As a set of decisions taken somewhere else, about assets and liabilities, by people who would never once work a shift on Grange Road. By 1962, the choice had been made at Small Heath. Ariel production would be lifted out of Selly Oak altogether and moved across the city into the BSA works. And the Selly Oak premises, the land, the buildings, the cathedral itself, would be sold. Sold as an asset, stripped out and cashed in. The site was worth more than the name that had been made inside it. Think of what that meant for a man who had spent 30 years inside those walls. The bench you knew, the lathe you had run since you were an apprentice, the gate you had walked through every working morning of your adult life, opposite the gunmakers, down off the Bristol Road. And then the notice that the work was going elsewhere and the walls were going to a buyer, and the world you had helped build was to be measured out in square feet and knocked down to the highest bid. Val Page, who had given Ariel its backbone in the 20s and its last brilliant machine in the 50s, retired quietly to the Cotswolds. The drawing office fell still, and the prototypes that might have been some kind of future were taken out and killed, one after another. There had been a street scrambler, the machine they called the TS5, that the factory test rider Graham Saunders had put nearly 10,000 hard miles beneath. There had been a new 350cc twin. There had even been an experimental square 4 quietly kept breathing in a corner, as though someone could not bear to let the old idea die. BSA had controlled Ariel's money for the better part of 2 decades, and it had not the slightest intention of funding 3 more machines from a mark it had already decided to wind down. The prototypes went nowhere at all. They were simply ideas that a firm with a future would have built, offered by a firm that had been told it did not have one. What could be moved was crated and carted across the city to Small Heath. The machine tools, the part-finished work, the last of the stock. What could not be moved was left where it stood. And what was left, in the end, was the building itself, a great brick shell that had held the noise and the heat and the pride of 2,000 working lives, standing empty on Grange Road, waiting for the buyer and, in time, for the demolition men. For the men themselves, there was no single dramatic morning, no gates chained shut in front of a shouting crowd. It came in the ordinary way these things come. A department wound down here, a job quietly moved there, a man told his work was going to Small Heath and that he was not going with it. Some found work in the other Birmingham factories, in a trade that was already beginning its own long decline. Some did not, and the skill in their hands, the particular unwritten knowledge of how to build an Ariel, had nowhere left to go. It simply left the world along with them. One retirement, one redundancy, one funeral at a time. A few last small things carried the badge onward for a season or 2. A 50cc machine called the Pixie in 1963. A smaller Arrow, the Arrow 200, in 1964. Little machines made in a corner of somebody else's factory, wearing a great old name that no longer had a home of its own. And then, in 1965, the last Ariel motorcycle was built. At the motorcycle show in Blackpool that year, the chairman of BSA said it out loud, in as many words: Ariel, as a maker of motorcycles, was finished. Production formally ceased not long after, in 1967. There was no ceremony worth the name. A great mark did not so much die as get switched off. We do not know exactly how many men lost their livelihoods when Selly Oak closed. The precise figures were never properly recorded, or if they were, they have not come down to us. An honest gap in the story, and one it would be wrong to paper over with a number invented for the sake of a stronger sentence. What the record does tell us is quiet, and it is final. Most of the Ariel workforce, one account says simply, understood long before the end that their end was coming. They had watched the 4-strokes go. They had watched the investment go to other markers. They knew. And it was not only the works that went quiet. The streets around it had been organised, for the better part of a lifetime, around the rhythm of those gates. The shifts, the hooter, the wage packet on a Friday that paid the rent, filled the larder and bought the children's shoes. The pub that filled at knocking-off time. The corner shops that lived on the trade. When the work goes, all of that goes with it. Slowly, like a tide drawing back down a beach. Bournebrook did not collapse in a single day. It simply lost, quietly and for good, the thing it had been built around. Some 66 years of motorcycle making in that one corner of Bournebrook. Gone. The works fell silent. The machine shop where men had turned and bored and fitted for a lifetime. The engine shop where the square 4s had droned their car-like drone on the test bed. The paint shop, the assembly line, the gates that had stood opposite the gunmakers since before most of the workers were born. All of it went quiet, in the particular way that a place built for noise goes quiet when the noise finally stops for good. No hooter at the change of shift. No queue at the gate in the grey of the morning. No test machines warming on their stands. Just an empty brick shell, and the Bournebrook running past it, exactly as it had run before any of it ever began. What becomes of a skill when the last pair of hands that held it puts down its tools and walks out for the final time? Nobody at Selly Oak was left to answer. There was nobody inside to hear the question at all. Chapter 10. Here it is, whatever it is. The name should have been allowed to rest. It was not. In 1970, BSA, the group now under the management of a man named Lionel Joffe, reached back for the dormant Ariel badge and pinned it onto the strangest machine ever to wear it. It was called the Ariel 3, and it was a 50cc moped with 3 wheels, 2 at the back, that leaned into corners on a pivoting joint, while the rear axle stayed flat and upright on the road. The tilting design had been licensed from an inventor named George Wallace. The little engine came from a Dutch firm, Anker, and BSA had convinced itself, on the strength of what it proudly called powerful market research, that this odd little contraption was the shape of the future. They launched it with all the confidence in the world. On the 11th of June 1970, outside the Royal Festival Hall in London, BSA gathered 200 journalists and unveiled the machine beneath a slogan that has comfortably outlived everything else about it. Here it is, whatever it is. Whatever it was, the public did not want it. BSA had planned to build 2,000 of them a week and had loaded up dealers the length of the country so that every showroom could hand one over for £100 on the day of the launch. In its disastrous first year, the Ariel 3 sold around 7,000. Not 7,000 a week, 7,000 full stop, in 12 months. The little Anker engine proved unreliable. The machine felt unstable to ride. Something close to £2 million had gone into the project, and tens of thousands of engines now sat stockpiled in a warehouse with almost nothing left to bolt them into. George Wallace, the designer, believed to the end of his days that the thing had been sold the wrong way entirely, that it should have gone into department stores, marketed to women who wanted simple, stable, sensible town transport, and never into motorcycle dealerships full of men who wanted anything on earth but this. One insider would later lay the blame more bluntly still on a remote management at BSA who, in his telling, did not even like motorcycles, and who made one appalling decision after another from a great height. The machine never had a chance, and the Ariel 3 did not merely fail on its own account. It helped pull the whole house down around it. In 1971, BSA posted a loss of £3 million. By 1973, the group, the giant of Small Heath, once the largest motorcycle maker in the entire world, had collapsed under the weight of its debts. The broader tide had never once stopped rising. By the middle of the 1970s, the whole of the British motorcycle industry, all of it together, was building around 20,000 machines a year. In 1975 alone, Honda built more than 2 million. A later study of the collapse, out of the University of Birmingham, laid the failure squarely at the door of the men in charge. A management, it concluded, simply not equal to running one of Britain's great industrial firms once that firm was thrown out into the open sea of global competition. BSA had employed some 8,000 people as late as 1966, most of them at Small Heath, its motorcycle division earning the lion's share of the entire group's profit. When it went down, it took the lot down with it. And there is a last, quiet turn of the wheel here, almost too neat to be believed, and yet entirely true. The Ariel name had begun its life, back in 1898, on a powered tricycle, and it ended its life, in 1970, on a powered tricycle. The tilting design that had helped bury it was in time licensed abroad, to Honda, of all firms, the very company that had buried the whole British trade, which built its own version of the idea and sold it as the gyro. The spirit of the Air went out on 3 wheels, and its very last idea went off to earn its living for the winners. Chapter 11. The Spirit of the Air. Go looking for the Ariel works today, and you will not find them. The buildings on Grange Road came down in stages, some around the turn of this century, the last stubborn remnants around 2009, cleared away to make room for a new relief road cut through Selly Oak. For a time, an old packaging firm had used part of the site. A gearbox maker had worked out of another corner of it in the 1990s. But the works themselves are gone. The ground where 2,000 people once built some of the finest motorcycles in the world now belongs to the University of Birmingham. Student accommodation, campus roads, the ordinary furniture of a modern city that no longer has any idea what once stood here. A few graffiti-covered walls clung on into this century. Then even those came down. The men are harder to find than the bricks. Their individual stories, who they were, where they went when the gates shut, what became of the deep skill in their hands, were mostly never written down at all. Even the devoted enthusiasts who keep this history alive today lament how little of that human testimony has survived. A great works can vanish and still leave its buildings in photographs and its machines behind museum glass, and yet lose, almost entirely, the people who were its actual living heart. That is the quietest loss of all, and it is the one the record can do the least to mend. But the spirit of the Air, true to the whole long shape of its history, refused to die completely. The Ariel Owners Motorcycle Club still thrives. It keeps a register of every surviving machine it can trace. It guards the original works drawings. It runs a scheme so that owners can still lay hands on the parts to keep the old bikes running. A specialist firm still manufactures and stocks components for Ariels built between the 20s and the 60s, so that a Red Hunter or a Square 4 need never fall silent for the want of a single casting. A good Square 4 today changes hands for around £17,000, and the very finest examples sit under lights in the National Motor Museum and the Science Museum, admired by people who will never hear one run. Two brothers named Healy even kept the great old engine alive into the 1970s, building a small handful of magnificent machines around it, a 1930s idea carried lovingly forward into a world that had left it behind, and the name itself came back. In 1999, an entirely unconnected company in the West Country took up the old word, Ariel, and put it on a stripped-bare featherlight sports car that would go on to become a small legend all of its own. The people who built it had almost certainly never walked down Grange Road and knew little of the works that once bore the name. They simply reached, exactly as Starley and Hillman had reached back in 1870, for a word that meant lightness and speed and the feeling of a thing that flies. So, that is what remains. Not the works. The works are student flats and a relief road now, and the Bourne Brook runs past them as if none of it ever happened. Not the men. Most of their names went unwritten and are lost. What remains is a machine or two beneath museum glass, a faithful club keeping the old engines turning over on Sunday mornings, and a name that has now outlived 4 separate corporate deaths and keeps on finding new bodies to inhabit. Ariel, the spirit of the air. It was always, from that very first wire-spoked wheel in 1870, a thing that would not stay long on the ground, and in the end, not even the men who let it fall could keep it there for good.